Good evening, and thank you for coming to tonight's Fulbright Forum. Tonight's presentation will last about 50 minutes. We ask that you hold all questions until the Q&A at the end, where there's going to be time for a short discussion. Afterward, please stay and enjoy light refreshments prepared by the KAC's office staff. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Joyce Kim. Originally from Texas, Joyce received her undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and is currently on the tail end of her Fulbright Junior Researcher Grant. We're lucky to have Joyce here tonight to give a presentation titled Monolithic Misrepresentation, the Political Resocialization of Early Adult North Korean Defectors. As immigrants, as ethnic Koreans with upbringings and habits vastly different from those of South Koreans, and as a heavily politicized group, North Korean defectors are at once marginalized and extensively studied. Nevertheless, Joyce has identified a dearth of scholarly literature examining the political resocialization of early adult defectors. Further, she has found that the work of defector activists promotes a narrative that does not accurately reflect the diversity of the political views of defectors. Joyce presents her research to us tonight through the analysis of a number of personal interviews, and will argue that the political resocialization of defectors is crucial to creating effective resettlement policy. So, with that, I'd like to invite Joyce to the front.
Thank you all so much for joining me here tonight. I know this weather is really beautiful, so to spend your Friday evening here, thank you so much for that. So yeah, as Ben mentioned, my title of the presentation today is Monolithic Misrepresentation, the Political Resocialization of Early Adult North Korean Defectors. So just to give context to why I started this project. So my grandparents on my dad's side are from North Korea, and actually my grandpa on my dad's side, he actually came from North Korea to South Korea in the 1950s, and he rode during Christmas time in 1950, there was a series of American ships that brought on defectors from North Korea to South Korea, and he was part of that, part of those 100,000 defectors who came to South Korea. So it's cool to think that about 60 years ago, my grandpa rode a U.S. boat and came to South Korea. Now here I am with the aid of the American government and the South Korean government here in South Korea too, so I thought that was a really cool connection. And so this also got me thinking, my grandparents are from North Korea, and I'm from Texas, so I think that being where Bush is from, there's a lot of rhetoric around nuclear weapons, but I really thought and asked myself, what about the people? There are 24 million people in North Korea. What are their lives like? So that got me to really interested about North Korea. I wrote my college admissions application on North Korea, and so here I am now doing research on this topic. So just to give some background on where we're going to go with this presentation, I'm going to start off with the background of this project, followed by the questions that I asked through my research, and then the methods that I used to analyze my findings, and then finally the findings themselves. So just as background, so because of nearly 70 years of division, North and South Korea have had vastly different political, economic, and social differences. And because of that, that's a lot of reasons why North Koreans defect over to South Korea. So it's been very different. And under the North Korea Refugee Protection and Settlement Act that was first created in 1997, defectors come, but they receive pretty extensive benefits from the South Korean government. This includes recognition as South Korean citizens. They go through a 3-month resettlement program that's mandatory for all defectors who come to South Korea. And they also get other additional benefits, whether this includes housing benefits or education benefits. And through all these efforts, $105 million will be spent on defector resettlement in 2016. So this is a pretty considerable amount of money. And taxpayers pay this money too, so a lot of South Koreans are also interested and intrigued by these issues because money to help this population comes directly from their coffers. But despite all the effort that goes in and the funds that go into helping defectors resettle, numerous studies have shown that defectors are behind in the areas of economic achievement, psychological and emotional health, educational advancement, and physical health as well. So going through this literature, I saw a lot of this, but then I couldn't help but wonder and think. I think when it comes to citizenship, when it comes to being part of a country, I think political participation is one form of doing that, especially in a democratic country. And I noticed there wasn't much literature on that, especially in the English-speaking realm. So I was really curious as to, okay, so how do defectors politically engage, especially coming from a country that is so vastly different, a totalitarian regime over to South Korea? So this got me thinking, where does political engagement fit into the puzzle when North Korean defectors come over to South Korea? And then, after thinking about it some more, I started really thinking about how North Korean defectors are a very politicized minority group, especially in South Korea. Issues related to North Koreans, defectors, inter-Korean relations are in the news very often. And people here, whether it's Park Yeon-mi, Shin Yong-hyuk, Lee Han-soo, I don't know if you all are familiar with these names, but all of these people go out on the international stage and talk about the human rights atrocities that are in North Korea. And there are also controversial political activities that are led by defectors themselves, whether it's USBs that are smuggled through with Korean dramas, foreign movies, in the hopes that information will be brought into North Korea and hopefully change minds and hearts. Whether it's balloons that are launched with propaganda leaflets and food and things like that. So as a result of that, not their political agents, yes, but them as an entity, the act of defecting in itself is a very political move. So I was really curious about this political perspective when it comes to defectors coming to South Korea. So there's this really great Vice documentary clip that talks about launching balloons into North Korea. This is a longer clip, it's 10 minutes, but I thought all this information was really necessary to bring context to my presentation.
The Korean War Memorial in the center of Seoul is a graveyard of tanks and planes and munitions from a war that ended in 1953. It was a war that divided this peninsula into two very, very different countries. And while the shooting war has ended, the propaganda war continues. North Korea is one of the world's most isolated countries, a hermit kingdom hermetically sealed from the rest of civilization. It's a country both astoundingly brutal and almost comically absurd. Its single television channel is dedicated to exalting the leadership of dictator Kim Jong-un and instilling fanatical devotion to his regime. North Koreans are allowed no external internet access, though some can gain access to the country's intranet, also populated entirely with regime propaganda. Getting information to the North was once the remit of the South Korean government, who launched balloons to disseminate propaganda over the border. But the so-called Sunshine Policy, instituted in 1998 to de-escalate tensions between the two countries, saw the balloon launches shelved. That task was then picked up by North Korean defectors. Today, these launches are increasingly controversial and have drawn gunfire from the North and intervention from the nervous South Korean government. It won't be guns and bombs that free the captive citizens of North Korea, activists say. It will be schmaltzy South Korean soap operas, overdubbed episodes of Friends, and an inflammatory Seth Rogen and James Franco film. Pyongyang declared Sony Pictures' The Interview, a movie which dramatizes the assassination of Kim Jong-un, to be a, quote, reckless U.S. provocative insanity.
It says something interesting about North Korea, that they decided to have the state mount an all-out assault on a movie studio because of a satirical movie starring Seth Rogen and James Franco.
When President Obama pinned an embarrassing leak of Sony emails on North Korea, Thor Halvorson, the frenetic and outspoken head of the New York-based Human Rights Foundation, announced a plan to challenge Kim Jong-un's monopoly on information. Halvorson is a controversial figure in South Korea, and his controversial idea? To rain the North with copies of The Interview. Along with a small group of Western journalists and Silicon Valley types, the Human Rights Foundation promised us access to a balloon launch. But first, we would be led around Seoul to meet defectors and activists, to learn about their sometimes primitive strategies for getting information into North Korea.
등수는 넘어붙습니다만 연습을 해봤습니다. 3사람이 하는 건데 근데 400야드가 넘어가니까 여기서 터프를 쏴가지고 USB라든지 그런 물자들 넘길 때
Kim Hong-kwang's expertise is actually more 21st century. Before defecting to the South, Kim was a computer scientist at Pyongyang, tasked with training the country's first generation of elite hackers.
천재입니다. 걔네들은 충분히 그동안의 실력을 쌓았다는 이번 같은 소니 해킹 같은 거는 뭐 사실상 충분히 하고도 남을 그런 전력을 가지고 있죠.
대표님 그 영화 보시나요?
네, 봤어요.
그게 어떻게
굉장히 그 풍자 영화라고 했는데 수업 같았는데 웃기진 않았어요. 미국 사람들이 북한을 저렇게 잘 모르느냐 그런 생각이 들었어요.
He's been threatened, beaten up, dead rats and blood-covered acts sent to his office. He's probably one of the pioneering defectors in terms of sending information into North Korea via shortwave.
근무 중간 환경에서도 북한 사람들은 이대학 소식이 그렇게 중요해 있어요. 꼭 듣고 싶어요. 미국의 선의방송을 통해서 탈북자들이 한국에 가도 죽이지 않는구나 알았고요.
Once people start getting a taste of these real human stories and real entertainment value, they very quickly get hooked on it, especially the younger generation. DVD players are surprisingly prevalent in North Korea, and crucially, all of the ones going in these days, they don't just have a DVD function, they have a USB input port as well.
You're not involved in really much stuff at all, right?
No.
What's your general sense of these things? Because I know, it's funny, because you think pretty straightforward stuff. It's a pretty divisive issue, isn't it?
Massively divisive.
Massively divisive. And what's your take on it?
This is for the record.
This is for the record. You're obviously a skeptic. You've revealed it already, just by these long... After an exhausting day of meeting defectors brutalized by the North Korean regime, the Human Rights Foundation told us that the balloons would be launched that night. So we were roused and brought up to the North Korean border, where we're actually going to launch the balloons at night to try to, keep the press away and to keep all the attention at a minimum, because attention in the past has been a bad thing. This military truck has the hydrogen in it, all the material that is going to be launched into North Korea. The launch was organized by defector Park Sang-hak, known as Target Zero in North Korea, its most dangerous enemy. In 2010, a North Korean agent was arrested in Seoul carrying a dozen poison-tipped needles. His target? Park Sang-hak. I was told by them that the police might come, and if they do come, there will likely be a confrontation. So we're going to unload the stuff now and launch some balloons. It turns out that they forgot the balloons. So, big bags of money and separated DVDs, but we have no way to get them right over there, which is North Korea, which you can't see because they don't have any power or lights.
In his 10 or 15 years of activism, he has never had something like this happen.
We'll just stand out here in the fucking cold on the border of North Korea, because that's totally fine, right? This is a banner of Kim Jong-un. They will be flying with the balloon fluttering in the background and hopefully flying over Pyongyang with a rather insulting message about the dear leader and the poster for the interview.
Tying the bags to the balloons.
Okay, so these are the bags that we're going to inflate.
Once the balloons are inflated, they'll have a special glue.
It will melt through?
Yeah, that's what releases these bags.
In their times?
Yeah. For that, Mr. Park said it would take about 3 to 5 hours.
There's dollar bills, there's cash in there, there's propaganda, and we also have thumb drives and copies of the interview. So this is the GPS you're putting on?
Yeah. So this is a GPS receiver and a satellite transmitter, and so it'll get the GPS position and then send that up to a satellite, which will bounce it back down to a server on the internet, and so we'll then be able to see the position of the balloon as it moves along.
So how many of those are you putting in? Everyone?
No, just one.
If anyone is smoking, please stop smoking immediately. That would be greatly appreciated.
So we have all 5 balloons filled now. We've done this in a way that they know where they're going to go. They know they're going north now. They just hope they get to civilization up north.
김정은 세습독제 타도하고 북한님이 해방하다. Freedom of Korean people! Freedom of Korean people! Down with the regime! Down with the regime! Freedom of Korean people! Freedom of Korean people! Down with Kim Jong-un! Down with Kim Jong-un!
I swear to God, if I fucking end up in Pyongyang hanging on to this. They look like they're gone. They're sort of circling above. And they seem to be going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so this clip just gives a snapshot of sort of the controversial nature of the types of activities that defector activists are doing. Next, I just want to show a brief 1-minute clip of Park Yeon-mi, who is a famous celebrity defector. She's one of those people that I mentioned earlier who goes out on the world stage and shares her narrative as a defector.
I have to do this because this is not I'm speaking. This is the people who wants to tell the world what they need to say. North Korea is an unimaginable country. There is only one channel on TV. There is only one channel. We aren't free to sing, say, wear, or think when we want. North Korea is the only country in the world that executes people for making unauthorized international phone calls. North Koreans are being terrorized today.
So you can see here how Park Yeon-mi shared a story at the One Young World Summit back in Dublin. Something that I want you all to focus on is at the very beginning where she says, I'm not here, I'm here, this is the North Korean people speaking. And that really stood out to me while I was doing my research. So I decided to focus on earlier adults or younger defectors for 2 main reasons. One, there was already prior literature available on how defectors around politically identified, which I'll cover in the next slide. But more importantly, I thought it was really interesting to see how defectors who have spent about half their lives in North Korea and half their lives in South Korea, how that process would have looked like for this population. So as I mentioned earlier, previous studies show that in 2012, 9 out of 10 defectors voted for a candidate from the conservative parties, but defectors in their 20s and 30s showed low support for conservative parties, kind of like their South Korean peers. So I was really interested in looking more and diving deep into what the political resocialization process was like for young adult North Korean defectors. So this led me to my research questions. One, are celebrity defectors like Park Yeon-mi, are defector activists like the ones we just saw in the Vice documentary, are they representative of the political perspectives of everyday young adult North Korean defectors? 2, what does the political resocialization process for early adult North Korean defectors look like? And then 3, how do early adult North Korean defectors identify and engage politically? So in order to answer these questions, I interviewed 21 defector university students to get an idea of how to answer, to get an idea, a sense of what their political socialization process was like. And just to give the breakdown of the demographics, it was pretty even split between females and males, a little more females. The majority of them were between the ages of 20 through 26. There were a couple who were in their late 20s. There was one who was in their early 30s, but most of them were in their 20s. And 3, in terms of the year that they left North Korea, the majority of them left between 2005 and 2009, but it was pretty even throughout the 2000s when they came over to South Korea. Also, the amount of time that was spent in both North Korea and South Korea. So North Korea, most people spent about 10 through 20 years, pretty even between how many years they split in South Korea, between 5 to 10 or a little more than 10. And then most people didn't spend that much time in other countries on their way to South Korea, but there were some who spent between 2 to up to 10 years in China, but that was a minority. And so how do you gauge, or how do you inquire about how the political resocialization process works? Well, I looked at 4 different categories that have to do with values, engagement, trust, and representation. So for values, I asked some questions on what do you think freedom is, what do you think about competition, obedience, and what was it like participating in very community-based activities in North Korea. So for example, they have something called self-criticism sessions where about once a week they'll come out amongst the community and they'll either talk about transgressions they've had or transgressions that people in their community that they've seen had, and they criticize each other and kind of criticize themselves. So that's an example of a community activity. Engagement, how much they consume the news, how often they vote or don't vote. Other political activities, whether it's signing a petition or being involved in a political club in their university. Discussing politics with their peers. How much trust they had in the North Korean and South Korean government, and what were their reasons for defecting. And then lastly, how they identified, both in terms of political party, whether they saw themselves as liberal or conservative, as well as their own thoughts on the defector activists and the celebrity defectors. So after I translated and transcribed all these interviews, I had all this data. But then the next question is, how do I analyze this data? Because there's so much of it. And so I took 2 different approaches. So I started off with a theory-driven or top-down approach. That means you go from general to specific. So if I have something called, let's say there's this theory, it's called the sky is blue theory. That means that if the theory states that every day that it's not raining, the sky is blue, what I would do is I would go out and I would collect data for maybe a month, see what color the sky is, and then from there I would either confirm or not confirm the theory. So that's how I started, and I'll go into more about what theories I use to start off my research. But then I found really interesting findings that didn't come out of theory, especially because this is not a very research topic. And these interesting things also allowed me to take a grounded theory or bottom-up approach where I had all this information. I was finding these really interesting patterns. And so if we were to take this sky is blue theory approach from an inductive perspective, I would, instead of starting up with a theory, I would perhaps go and observe the color of the sky every day. And then I would say, oh, it seems the sky is blue the days that it's not raining or it's not sunrise or sunset, and then perhaps I would come up with this theory. So those are the different approaches that I took. So when it comes to political resocialization, or the deductive coding that I started off, when I was starting off this research, I found that in the realm of political resocialization, there were 3 different theories that popped up in the literature often. This was exposure theory, resistance theory, and transferability theory. So what resistance theory is that it says that if I am in country A, that means that a lot of my political values will have been formed in country A. So coming to country B, I'll be really resistant to the political environment of country B. So it's a pretty pessimistic view of political resocialization. Then you have exposure theory, which is sort of the opposite, it's a more positive view. It says that even though I grew up with country A in North Korea with very different political environment, if I come to country B and the longer that I'm in country B or South Korea, the more I'm exposed to the political environment of South Korea, the more I will adapt to the South Korean political environment. And then 3, transferability theory, is kind of in a mix of the two, where it says that I will take attitudes and beliefs that I had in country A and I will bring them with me to country B. So if in country A I was like, oh hey, the North Korean regime was really bad, I don't like the political aspects of it, and if I come to country B, I will be a lot, or South Korea, I'll be a lot more participatory because the country is more democratic. So in order to gauge these things, I specifically borrowed from cross-cultural psychology to look at concepts of individual and collectivism and to measure how much their beliefs have changed throughout those things. And that's why earlier you saw trust, competition, obedience, those are the things I gauged on. So a quick clip that I thought did a good job of discussing individualism and collectivism.
Or collectivism. Do you define yourself as an I or a we? In considering cultural dimensions or attributes, individualism, the I, is a preference for independence and self-reliance. As an individual, you are expected to take care of yourself and your immediate family, but you have no obligations to a larger community. Cultures which focus on individualism celebrate the accomplishments of a person rather than a group. For example, does your employer single out an employee of the month? Employees from that background, the I background, might more naturally seek to advance their own interests within the job rather than that of the entire organization. Australia, the US, the UK are all individualist cultures emphasizing the obligations of the individual's human rights, the individual's personal responsibilities. Are you familiar with the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? This comes from cultures focusing on that individual. By contrast, other cultures on the other end of the spectrum, such as China or Pakistan or Venezuela or Ghana, the group is of paramount importance. This is collectivism. An individual is expected to be loyal to that group and not advance his or her own personal interests at the expense of the group. To operate outside the interests of the group is considered downright shameful, both to the individual and that group, whether family or work-based.
So based on those theories, my findings were, 1, according to exposure theory, defectors who have been in South Korea longer will become more individualistic in their political engagement. And I found that about 48% of these respondents became more individualistic in their political engagement the longer they were in South Korea. But individualistic behavior, usually in political resocialization, means that they'll be more politically engaged, they'll be voting, they'll be really seeking what is going on politically in their host country. But I found that that wasn't necessarily the case. By individualistic, it was more so this idea of developmental citizenship that came up. So as many of you all may know, South Korea rapidly industrialized in the 1980s. And as a result of that, economic growth was at the very forefront of the country. And so I think remnants of this sort of policy are in existence in South Korea today, where a lot of things are very hyper-competitive, very economically driven. And out of the 10 individuals who adhere to this exposure theory hypothesis, about 60% said political engagement is important, but I have more important things to attend to, and these things tend to be like getting a job, getting good grades to get a good job, getting a job at the best company. So it was a very economically honed perspective. Something interesting that I really found as well is that when asking these people why they defected, they said it was not a personal choice, it was to follow the family. And then according to the other hypothesis that held for this study was, according to transferability theory, defectors who displayed individualistic attitudes in North Korea will display behaviors of political engagement in South Korea. And 38% of individuals displayed individualistic attitudes in North Korea and displayed behaviors of political engagement in South Korea. And in contrast, when asked about why these people defected, it was a very personal choice. So whether it's someone who stole a bike from their aunt's house to go sell it in order to cross over into China, or someone who had access to radio and listened to radio and watched KBS because they were by the sea, so their house picked up the broadcast, so they spend years listening and watching South Korean media. There was someone whom I talked to who was in jail for 8 years, and this person was almost sent to a concentration camp. And then people who explicitly mentioned freedom in their reasoning for defecting. So I thought that was really interesting that their reasons for defecting sort of portrayed or kind of determined how politically involved they would be here once they come to South Korea. So next, this is what I thought was the really exciting part when it came to the data analysis, sort of the inductive coding, or the information that came up without the theory that a theory in mind that I had beforehand is. And so these are the 3 themes that came up. The importance of voting, what I call sans safe space, and then finally monolithic misrepresentation, which is the title of this presentation. So 86% expressed they would vote/voted for the National Assembly elections that happened this past April. And considering that the national voting turnout was 58%, I thought this was pretty astounding. And the accompanying things that people said when talking about voting, I thought blew my mind away. Whether it's someone saying voting is really important because in North Korea, 99.9% of people chooses just one person, but in South Korea, you get to think about who you choose. So because of the blood, sweat, and tears that my predecessors in South Korea, they demonstrated for this democracy, as a result of that, I feel a duty to vote as a citizen. Or all my friends played on election day, but I got up at 6:30 in the morning and went in the rain to go vote because although in reality I knew that my one vote wouldn't make a difference, I realized that I wanted a result where my viewpoints were displayed. And then this quote really moved me. This quote. Recently we had an election, so I voted. When I voted, tears welled up in my eyes. With my own hands, I was able to express my own thoughts and ideas into a vote. I felt so proud. People in South Korea, I think, take voting for granted. So in that moment, I thought, I'm the only one who probably feels this way. But I didn't care. In that moment, I was filled with happiness, like I was floating, like I was rising. So I thought this was a really beautiful way to think about voting. And as someone who was born and raised in the United States, it really made me reassess the privileges I had for the right to vote. Next, this idea of sans safe space, or without a safe space. 71% of the respondents expressed that they don't talk about political issues with friends because they feel it's pointless and their friends aren't interested. And 43% of the respondents, when I was talking with them, expressed great hesitance when disclosing their political party preferences. So when I asked them about, oh, hey, what political party do you prefer, or how do you align politically, they would say things like, oh, am I allowed to say that, or isn't that a secret? And they would hesitate a lot, and there would be a lot of nervous laughter. This was a common pattern I saw. And then further quotes to demonstrate that. I still don't know much about the South Korean government, but as someone who's alone and doesn't have parents, I wish I could ask someone about these things and someone can teach me, but that seems to not be the case. So I try to watch the news and learn by myself. Or when I speak with my college friends, they're bored about talking about reunification, and for the professor, they pretend to be interested in this topic, but in reality, that's not the case. So I feel like I'll be boring if I bring up this topic. It's uncomfortable to do so. Oh, and this quote also, it's long, but I put in there because what he said was really way too. Although we should be totally free to speak our opinions, because South Korea is a democracy, we can't deeply discuss politics, and I think South Korea is still a young democracy. I became a political science major, and I took pride in that major. And I think politics is the most beautiful form of service in the world. I think the world goes on through politics. If you govern well, the people can live well, but if you mess up, you get a country like North Korea. With that thought and love, politics allows people to live with humanity. But in South Korea, it's a word that's seen negatively. Seeing this, I wondered why has a word as beautiful as politics become so negatively charged? And I thought this was a really poignant and beautiful way of talking about politics that I really come across my peers. So I think it once again led me to think about politics and think about sort of my own privilege being in the United States or being from the United States, especially in the midst of election seasons that's happening right now. And another person also said, I think that with any issues, through talking with others that you're able to learn, it's not a bad thing to share your perspective. It's through sharing that you can learn things, but many people are really cautious. I personally didn't want to be cautious, but my friends aren't interested, so I end up not talking about these issues with them. Regarding monolithic misrepresentation, 67% viewed the balloon propaganda as negative. They cited reasons of it exacerbated inter-Korea relations, it wastes resources, it's not very efficient, and in their words they said it exploits and uses defectors, which I thought was really powerful language to describe this. And 86% cited, which is pretty high, negative aspects to celebrity defectors, including the exaggeration. That's a huge point of controversy for many of these famous celebrity defectors who go and testify about their narrative. They question the efficacy and motivation of their work, and they think it monopolizes and standardizes the narrative. Defector activists are not representative of all defectors. Through their work, people think, oh, it must be like, all defectors must be like this, but that's not true. Because of that, I don't see them positively. And I want to bring you back to that clip of Park Mi that I showed you all, where she distinctively said, oh, hey, this is me, I'm representing North Korea. And defectors whom I encountered, they don't like that. South Korea is told not to send over propaganda balloons, so we shouldn't send them over. And there's really someone moderating this activity, so I don't think it'll be really useful. But I think there's a lot of financial backing from overseas entities. I don't know who all exactly does it, but they get financial support from abroad. Because of that, defectors are used and exploited. I actually talked to someone who encountered a balloon while she was in North Korea. So what had happened was she was in the mountainside and she accidentally went astray. And so she's found a deflated balloon, and in the balloon there were chocolates and leaflets. But she was so shocked that she just took it and folded it, and then she took it to her mom and was like, oh my gosh, why do you have this? And she said she was so skeptical that she couldn't even eat the chocolate or enjoy the chocolates because she was so scared of it. So that for her perspective and from other respondents I interviewed, these things are not very effective. Granted, there was one person I interviewed who had a friend who came over to South Korea because this person encountered a balloon, but it seemed like most of the respondents felt that this was very negative. And once again, I think celebrity defectors standardize their narratives. In other words, they make it seem like their own story is representative of their experiences with other defectors, even though it's their own personal story. I wish they would have a disclaimer that it's just their own story. So I think that's something really interesting to think about too, especially as a lot of these celebrity defectors, like Yeonmi Park, she published a book that's now translated into so many different languages. She's now a student at Columbia. But I think it goes to show that there's so many defectors with different narratives, and I think many defectors are not happy with sort of the monopolizing or the standardization of the narratives that are being shared. So as takeaways from my findings, once again there was the deductive reasoning and the inductive reasoning. So from the theory-based approach, you have the exposure theory. The longer they're here, the longer they seem to go into this developmental citizenship model and fall into the sort of hyper-competitiveness of South Korean society. Transferability theory, if they came here of their own personal choice, it seemed like they're a lot more willing to be politically engaged. And then in terms of the inductive reasoning, perhaps we should consider, we should perhaps make sure that defectors have the knowledge to be informed voters. Provide a space for defectors to engage in dialogue about political issues. It seemed like a decent amount of defectors wanted that space. And then finally, reassess funding for defector activists and reframe portrayal of celebrity defectors. So the South Korean government stance officially is, especially against the balloon propaganda, is such that they are against it. But recently there have been a lot of articles. There was recently in the Wall Street Journal, I think last month or so, that said the U.S. government will be funding these organizations that are doing these types of activities. So perhaps we should reconsider how effective they are and what exactly they are doing, and also how we portray these celebrity defectors. So I guess now it's time for questions.
You mentioned something at the beginning that comes up in the media here frequently, how marginalized these people are, and how the defectors generally have a very hard time economically, health, and
and socially. What, in your opinion, having met a number of these folks and spoken with them and interacted with them, what can be done to make their transition easier and more favorable?
I think there are a variety of different things, and I think first it's really important to take sort of a case-by-case approach. Everyone's story is so different, and perhaps one of the reasons why the current efforts are not as effective as they can be is because they sort of take a one-size-fits approach, whether it's the mandatory Hanuman process, things of that nature. I think one, perhaps emphasizing the psychological part of it is very important. I think recently now, South Korean officials are understanding how important the psychological aspect of it, and I think they're just now starting to put in more resources for that area, but I think that part is important. I think a lot of it has to do with addressing how the South Korean populace views the defectors. I think that's really one of the key things that isn't really being addressed. I think South Koreans, I think their different perspectives are emerging, but I think now even more so as the division, the number of years since the division are continuing on, South Koreans are more and more not starting to identify with North Koreans as much. The narrative of we are one people, that along with the political aspects of it too, that sort of allowed South Koreans to have a much more warm stance towards defectors, I think is quickly dissipating. And I think as a result of that South Korean money, people are saying, oh hey, like I have my own family to feed, why should I give up tax money to help defectors? So I think as a result of that, the stance and perception towards defectors from the South Korean perspective is not ideal, and I think is lending itself to the discrimination and prejudice that defectors have, and I think are a large part of why it's so difficult for them to resettle. I think another component is mismanagement of expectations. I think many people are sort of disheartened once they come over to South Korea, whether it's the hyper-competitive nature, whether it's how they are received by their South Korean peers. So I think that mismatch. There are even people who, especially recently, have said, I want to go back to North Korea. I think there was someone in the New York Times within the last year who attempted to go back, although her case is a little bit different because she came here for medical reasons, or so she says, but increasingly there are people who say that kind of thing.
Why did they come? What were the reasons that they gave you?
For the respondents, a large amount of them, particularly because they're younger, they came to follow family, and a lot of them it wasn't their personal choice. It was to see their parents, to be reunited with family, but then there was another subset that they either were politically persecuted, so they had experience going to prison, or they thought after they had exposure to foreign media and they realized, okay, there's nothing much more I can do here in North Korea. And a decent amount of them had no family. Their family had passed away during the famine, or for whatever reason their family was non-existent. So because of that, they said, I can't really do anything here. My prospects are so limited here. So that was another trend I saw amongst why people came over to South Korea.
And did they come alone? I mean, teenagers, they just...
Some of them, yeah.
How did they do it?
So their stories really depend, like that person who, this person stole a bicycle. This person was, trying to protect anonymity here. This person was at their aunt's place and they said, there's nothing more that I can do. So they stole a bike, and apparently bikes are very a valued commodity over in North Korea, so they sold the bike and then they used that money to cross over. And that person's mother had been in South Korea before, and so once they reached China, they contacted the mom, who was really shocked that this person came of their own volition and sent a broker. So that's one example. Some people just jump the bullet and cross the river. Other people go through brokers or family in China and South Korea. So it really varies. Go this way.
Joyce, really interesting study, and I hope that you continue along with this and get it published, because I think some of the findings offer a corrective to many of the perceptions and discussions surrounding defectors. I just have a curiosity about the individualism bit and some of the slides that you showed. What were the specific elements of individualism that you identified and then led you to form the sense, anyway, that individualism seems to be rising in certain politically engaged segments of North Koreans? And I ask because in South Korean society, I'm not really sure how I would pinpoint that on a continuum with individualism on one end and collectivism on the other. I mean, those two groups of countries that were listed as the archetypes, I'd probably put this one, as I'm sure you all know, maybe at a midpoint. It's not really individualistic in the same way as some of the Anglo-American countries, even if elements of the democracy and the way the democracy is set up would seem to mirror that. I mean, there's an awful lot of collectivism within this country itself and its people. So I'm just wondering, more detail how you went about situating the defectors, and then more about how you position the native South Koreans in relation to that as well.
Right. I think the individualism and collectivism part was more of a comparative basis versus there one South Korea is here and North Korea is here, especially when you have Anglophone countries in mind. So it was a comparison. And in doing this, the reason why I chose to do individualism and collectivism was I found literature that used this model. They borrowed from cross-cultural psychology as well to address political resocialization. That's where I sort of got the idea for it. And from there, they identified values that sort of resonate more with individualistic societies versus collectivistic societies. Earlier in the presentation, when I was showing my questions, that's the reason why I had political values, whether it was freedom, competition, obedience, and how their thoughts on participating in community-based activities. And a lot of what emerged was that a lot of people said they didn't know that it was so matter of fact that it was only after coming to South Korea that they became woke. That's the exact term that they used, woke. And so that's sort of how I gauged whether they were individualistic or collectivistic, how they reflect back on their experiences in North Korea and say, oh wow, I thought this, people distinctly say, I didn't even know freedom really existed, or people, respondents said, I didn't really encounter this term politics or this concept of politics until I came to South Korea. So that's sort of how I gauged them becoming more individualistic based on how they reflected back on their experiences in North Korea, which for all intents and purposes, I viewed as much more collectivistic in South Korea, although South Korea has collectivist elements within its society as well. Here, right back.
I think earlier you mentioned that there is a generational difference sort of about like what political party they're more interested in. So have you been able to explore if there's a dialogue between the different generations among North Korean defectors?
No, I haven't, but I think that is a possible good springboard for further research and limitations of this research as well, because throughout my research too, they said, oh, if you talk to older people like my mom, I think you would get different answers. Because of limitations and capacity, I decided to hone in on early adult defectors, but I think that is a really interesting look at what can be done for further research. So one of my respondents did say that because they could not talk to their friends about these issues, they ended up talking to their mom, and they talked with their mom about political issues about 2 to 3 times a month. So I think, her case is not necessarily representative, but I think that's an example of there being generational dialogue.
And just a following question, so would they feel more comfortable talking about it amongst themselves, like amongst the young North Korean defectors, more than with their South Korean peers?
It really varies. One person said, oh, I don't talk about this with my defector friends because they don't really think about politics. It's too abstract of a subject with them. Someone said that. Another person said, oh, I only talk with my defector friends, but they particularly honed on reunification, so that we talk about reunification together. So I think it depends. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious, it was really impressive that so many people among the defectors opposed the balloons. But what do they think is a constructive form of engagements and activities? And I raise it because I did a lot of interviews with Poles who left Poland under communism and developed extensive news services that shipped dispatches back to Poland, and they thought that was a vital activity. What do the North Korean defectors think is useful?
So a lot of people mentioned that they found bringing in information through USBs a lot more useful, say, than these balloon propaganda leaflets, although that can be dangerous too, because if you're caught with it, then you're in trouble, but they found that to be more useful. Someone else in an interview said they know an organization an underground organization, it's not really well known, that collects items that could be sold to the underground black markets, directly contributing to the economic activity. And although that's really underground, this person said, perhaps I think this is a lot more effective than, say, these balloon leaflets. Yes?
My question is similar to hers. But do they feel comfortable to show their real identity with their Korean fears? I mean, do they still have North Korean accent?
It really depended. I think it depended on how long they were in South Korea or how long, how young they were when they came over to South Korea. I felt that some of them, if they didn't tell me, I don't think I would have known. And for some of them, it was a little more evident that they were defectors that had come from North Korea. I feel like there was another part to your question.
Me? Oh, yeah. Because I'm working at school, high school, and we always teach about like Korean reunification and the needs to be reunified. So I still feel many students feel about like reunification is very important for Korea and is the utmost importance in school curriculum as well. So I wonder if they come to South Korea, they feel comfortable to show their real identity with the Korean peers, or they try to hide their real identity because of the bias.
Right. I think from my direct experiences, I found that a good amount of people do try to hide their identity, particularly when they're in middle school, because they get ridiculed. Like I've heard narratives of being called, like they say, we get called like a baigani or like a red shirt, I guess, and they don't want that. But there are other people who end up, I guess, becoming older and the longer they're in South Korea, sort of owning their identity as someone from North Korea too. Like I've talked to people who say, I'm proud to be from North Korea. So based on my personal experiences, I've really seen a range of people in terms of their willingness to disclose that they're from North Korea. But I think that many people, when they're younger and they first come here, they want to disclose for fear of prejudice and discrimination.
My question is more about the reunification aspect. So your research focuses on early adulthood North Korean defectors. So like, what are some of their views about reunification? Because the current, I guess, younger population here in South Korea is kind of negatively focuses on North Korean. It's mostly the older people that are more pro reunification. You know, as they're getting older, they hope that would happen. So, like, what are some of their views about reunification?
Right. So, because it was, reunification, I think, is a part of the political process because it's in terms of defectors. But my research didn't focus explicitly on reunification. So,
like in interviews, did you hear anything?
Yes. A term that came up was something called 작은통일, or small reunification. So that's sort of like exchange between defectors and South Koreans to prepare to kind of create an environment where if reunification were to happen, it could be a more peaceful and smooth process. And there were maybe like three or four respondents who directly referenced this term, small reunification. And there was one respondent who created a club and has run this club for 2 years at their university to hopefully promote small reunification between defectors and South Korean citizens.
So define small reunification. Like
so small reunification is this idea of getting, I think it's idea of exchanging, intercultural exchange between the two people so that it's a the hope is so that if reunification were to happen, it'd be a smoother process and they can be sort of the change agents in that.
Yes, so I have a quick question for clarification and a follow-up depending on that. But so all of your interviewees were university students?
Yes.
And I was curious if you had thought about interviewing non-university students and how that played into your research.
Yeah.
Kind of, the university experience probably changes
Exactly.
their politicalization as well.
Right. So that was definitely a limitation. There are two reasons why I decided to focus on university students. One had to do with capacity. Defectors are not the easiest to interview, and there's a lot of hesitance. One person straight up told me, hey, if you're considering doing this more, you should give your interviews at least 10,001 because they get so many requests. So they're very, as one of my advisors, but they're a very overstudied group proportionate to the population, about 30,000 people. So they get many requests for this type of thing. Two, I thought that the university is a place where students are able to be exposed to ideas of politics and would be able to think about these things more. And I wanted to sort of tease out those narratives. I think further research would involve asking non-university students in that age range as well. But for purposes of this study, I wanted sort of that, what I would view as, or what I hypothesized would have been more rich data, which is why I decided to only interview university students.
Joyce, let's do like 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, sounds good.
So what do you think was the reason that 90% of the North Korean students voted for the conservative party? Like, since you mentioned that they can't talk about politics with their South Korean friends and they are also different from their parents, their political views, so were they like pretty much affected by the conservative Korean media?
Yeah, so just to clarify, that was not part of my research. That was part of my prior research, where prior research has shown that in the 2012 presidential election, out of all the defectors, 9 out of 10 voted for this conservative party candidate, not the younger people. So just to clarify that. In regards to my own research, it was actually, I think 4 people voted for the Conservative Party. About 8 said they were liberal, or they voted for liberal parties. These numbers might be off by 1 or 2. And other people said they didn't disclose or say, I don't identify with a particular party. I just look at the candidate.
Yes, I got very impressive about the fact that the young defector got the low support for the conservative party compared to the South Korean peers. So could you say that the young defector are skeptical to the current government policy to the North Korea?
It really depends. Out of the people I talked to, there were some of them were, and it seemed to be those that had stayed in South Korea longer, but they were skeptical of just politics in general because they felt that there were a lot of unfulfilled promises. A big buzzword that came up was the Sewol ferry incident. I think several people explicitly mentioned that as a point of lost trust for the South Korean government that I found really, really fascinating. And for one person, it was what enabled, what caused this person to become more politically engaged. So I think this Sewol ferry was pretty pivotal. But I think it really depended. There were people who both identified for preferred the Samurai Party and the Liberal parties, but for what was surprising was sort of the differing reasons. There are people who identified as liberal but said, oh, the people in power is Henry, so in order to get anything done, I still go for this Henry. There are people who said things like, oh, this Henry person said something really inappropriate on TV I didn't really like, so I don't like them. So it really ran the gamut.